Okay, this video is going to be pivotal because we're going to introduce a brand new coding concept that is so fundamental that every single video going forward is going to depend upon this one. So listen up and listen well. We are going to introduce the concept of a variable. Now, at first glance, when I show you variables in coding, they're going to look suspiciously like variables from algebra, but in reality, they have nothing to do with variables from algebra. Let's go ahead and create our first variable. Fred equals 1. What I am doing here is creating a variable called Fred and saying that Fred refers to the number 1. You can think of variables as a kind of a box. So in this case, we have a box whose name is Fred, and this box, called Fred, contains the number 1. Now, if we go ahead and hit the play button, you can see that nothing appears in the terminal. And why is that? Well, you already know the answer to that. And that's because we've never used the P keyword to display anything in our terminal. So now if we go ahead on line 2 and say P Fred and hit the play button, let's see what we get. We get 1 in the terminal. So on line 1, when we say Fred equals 1, we are what's called setting a variable, which is a fancy way of saying creating a variable called Fred. Fred is the name of our box, and our box contains the number 1. On line 2, we say pFred, which means let's display to the terminal the contents of the box called Fred. Since the contents of Fred is the number 1, it is the number 1 that gets displayed in the terminal. Now, to make more sense out of variables, we need to introduce a rule. I call this rule the William Howard Taft rule of variables. As you may know, William Howard Taft was the 27th U.S. president, and this rule is the 27th rule I've ever come up with in my life. So it is the William Howard Taft rule of variables, and that rule is that whenever you refer to a variable in your code, it always refers not to the box itself, but to its contents, with one exception, and that is when you create a variable. So on line 2, when we reference Fred and we say pFred, we're not referring to the box, but instead we are referring to its contents. Whenever we refer to the name of a variable, we're actually referring to its contents, not to the box itself, with the one exception. The exception is when we are creating a variable, as we are doing on line 1. There, when we refer to Fred, we're referring to the actual box. So on line 1, we're saying we're going to make a box, we're going to make this variable whose name is Fred, and put a 1 in it. Have the box hold the number 1. So there, when we say Fred, we're talking about the box. We're talking about the box called Fred and saying that Fred should contain the number 1. But on line 2, when we say pFred, we're saying print the contents of the box, which in this case is 1, and that's why we see 1 in the terminal rather than the word Fred. Now, let me show you something interesting. If on line 3, I say Fred equals 2, and then say pFred, and we hit the play button, we will see that the terminal displays first 1 and then 2, which demonstrates that we can essentially reset a variable. So even though on line 1, the box Fred contained the number 1, but on line 3, we're saying, you know what? Now we want the Fred variable to contain the number 2 instead. So on line number 1, we're saying that the Fred variable should contain the number 1. On line 2, we say print the contents of Fred. Since at that point in time, the contents of Fred is 1, we get the 1 in our terminal. Then on line 3, we say, you know what? Let's reset this variable called Fred and say that Fred should contain the number 2. By the time we get to line 4 and we say print the contents of Fred, at that time, Fred is now containing the number 2, which is why the number 2 gets displayed in the terminal next. Finally, let's clear our code and show you something else. What happens if we say 4 equals Fred? Let's hit play and find out. We get an error message. As you can see, the error takes place on line 1, Syntax error unexpected equals expecting end of input. This simply illustrates another important rule about variables, which is when you are setting a variable, you must always put the variable name on the left-hand side of the equal sign and the value, that is the information you're putting into it, on the right-hand side. So the correct syntax for setting a variable is Fred equals 4. 4 equals Fred is simply not the Ruby way of setting a variable. It is considered invalid syntax. Ruby, as you can see, gives you an error message. So the proper way of setting a variable is to put the variable name on the left and the data that you're inserting into this variable box on the right.